The grand chamber of the Imperial Station floated in the darkness of space like a jewel among the stars. Inside its massive halls, representatives from over 100 different worlds gathered for what they considered a routine meeting. The air hummed with the sound of translation devices converting thousands of languages into coherent conversation. Beings of every imaginable shape and size filled the tiered seating that rose up toward the dome ceiling where artificial stars twinkled in patterns that mimicked the galactic core. Commander Zethrak stood in the waiting area outside the main chamber. His reptilian features were weathered and scarred from decades of service to the Empire. Deep claw marks ran across his face from a battle on the ice world of Kryn Prime. His right arm bore the burn scars from plasma fire that had killed his entire unit on Vega Station. He had seen more combat than most of the council members combined, and that experience weighed heavily on him now. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Zethrax walked into the chamber. His boots clicked against the polished floor as he made his way to the center platform, where witnesses and experts addressed the council. Above him on their elevated seats sat the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. High Counselor Vrenthal occupied the central throne, his crystalline body refracting light in rainbow patterns across the walls. Zethrax activated the holographic display, and images of a small blue planet appeared in the air around him. Continents and oceans rotated slowly as data scrolled past in multiple languages. The planet was called Earth, and it sat on the outer rim of the galaxy in a system the locals called Sol. The commander began his report with a steady voice that carried authority earned through blood and survival. He had spent 3 months reviewing every piece of intelligence the Empire had gathered on these humans. Their history was unlike anything he had encountered in 40 years of military service across the galaxy. These beings had been fighting each other since they climbed down from the trees. They had weaponized everything from rocks to atoms, and they showed no signs of stopping. High Counselor Vrenthal listened with what appeared to be patience, but Zethrax could sense the dismissive attitude behind those glowing eyes. The Council had heard warnings before about dangerous species, and each time the Empire had prevailed through superior technology and overwhelming numbers. They saw no reason why these humans would be any different. Counselor Drexel, a being of pure energy contained within a diplomatic shell, interrupted the presentation. The question was predictable and insulting. Why should the Empire fear a species that had barely achieved faster than light travel? They had no territory beyond their own star system. Their weapons were primitive compared to Imperial plasma cannons and molecular disruptors. Their largest ships were smaller than Imperial escort vessels. Zethrax pulled up footage captured by long-range observation drones. The holographic display showed human cities being destroyed by their own weapons. Mushroom clouds rose above population centers during something the humans called World War II. Millions had died in those conflicts, and yet the species had not only survived, but thrived. They rebuilt their cities and continued fighting new wars with even deadlier weapons. The commander changed the display to show human military training. Soldiers ran through obstacle courses designed to push them to their physical limits. They practiced with weapons until the movements became automatic. They studied tactics and strategy with an intensity that suggested warfare was not just something they did, but something they were. Every human culture had warrior traditions going back thousands of years. They taught their children about famous battles and legendary soldiers. They wrote songs and stories glorifying combat and sacrifice. Counselor Vrenthal waved a crystalline appendage dismissively. The gesture suggested that Zethrax was wasting the Council's time with irrelevant details. So the humans fought each other throughout their history. Many species went through violent phases during their development. Once they achieved spaceflight and made contact with the broader galactic community, they usually settled down and became civilized members of the Empire. But Zethrax had fought warriors from the death worlds of the galactic core. He had faced the Kryn hordes who knew nothing but battle from the moment they hatched. He had survived ambushes by the shadow clans of Noir 3, who could kill in 1,000 different ways. He recognized the signs of a species that would not simply accept subjugation because the alternative seemed impossible. The commander pulled up comparative analysis data. Human reaction times were slower than many galactic species. Their physical strength was average at best. They could not breathe toxic atmospheres or survive in extreme temperatures without protection. By every measurable standard, they should be easy to conquer. But Zethrax had learned long ago that numbers on a screen did not tell the whole story. He showed the council footage of human endurance events. Men and women running for hundreds of miles through deserts and mountains, soldiers carrying heavy packs across frozen wastelands, rescue workers digging through rubble for days without rest to save trapped civilians. Humans were persistence hunters who had evolved to outlast their prey through sheer stubborn determination. They did not give up when logic said they should. The council members murmured among themselves, but Zethrax could tell they were not convinced. Counselor Drexel suggested sending a small conquest fleet to the Sol system. The humans had resources the Empire needed, including rare metals, and a planet with ideal atmospheric conditions for several member species. Their resistance would be minimal, and the operation would serve as good training for newly commissioned officers. Zethrax felt his blood run cold at the casual way they discussed invading the human homeworld. He had seen this before on other campaigns. The Empire would send what they considered an overwhelming force only to discover they had severely underestimated the enemy's willingness to fight. The difference was that most species eventually surrendered when the cost became too high. Something in his gut told him humans would not. The commander spoke again, and his voice carried a tone that made several council members sit up straighter. He had fought beside soldiers from a dozen different worlds. He had commanded fleets and led ground assaults on hostile planets. He knew the difference between an army that fought because they were ordered to, and warriors who fought because something deep inside them demanded it. Humans were the latter. He told the council about a human concept called fighting to the last man. Most species had similar phrases, but for humans it was not just an expression. Their history was filled with examples of small groups fighting against impossible odds, simply because surrendering was unthinkable. A place called Thermopylae, where 300 men held off an army of thousands. An island called Iwo Jima, where soldiers fought over every meter of volcanic rock. A city called Stalingrad, where millions died rather than retreat. Counselor Vrenthal had heard enough. The decision was made, and nothing the old commander said would change it. The vote was called, and the result was nearly unanimous. The Empire would send a conquest fleet to the Sol system within 1 month. General Craven would command the operation with 20 capital ships and over 100 support vessels. It would be a simple show of force that would bring the humans into the Empire, peacefully or by force. Zethrax stood in the center of the chamber as the council members filed out discussing trade, agreements, and resource allocation. They were already planning how to divide up the Sol system, as if the conquest was a foregone conclusion. The old warrior felt a deep unease settle in his chest like a stone. He had done his duty and given his warning. Now he could only watch as the Empire marched toward a fate he had seen too many times before. He walked slowly back to his quarters aboard the station. Through the viewport he could see the Imperial fleet preparing for deployment. Ships moved through the orbital traffic lanes like great metal fish, swimming through an ocean of stars. Somewhere out there was a small blue planet whose inhabitants had no idea what was coming. They were about to receive a very rude awakening, and Zethrax suspected the Empire was going to learn a hard lesson about underestimating desperate prey. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the United Earth Defense Vessel Ranger, watching the sensor displays with growing concern. 3 weeks had passed since the alien fleet appeared at the edge of the solar system, like ghosts emerging from the darkness between stars. Every attempt at communication had been met with the same cold response demanding immediate and unconditional surrender. Jake had served in 2 major conflicts on Earth, and he recognized the posture of an invasion force preparing to strike. The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency around their stations. Lieutenant Amy Clark sat at the tactical console running constant updates on the alien fleet's position and composition. Her fingers danced across the holographic controls as she tracked each ship's energy signature and weapons status. Behind her, Ensign Danny Price monitored communications while trying repeatedly to establish any kind of dialogue with the approaching vessels. Jake had been in command of the Ranger for 2 years. The ship was one of 6 defenders stationed in the outer system as an early warning network. They were fast scout vessels armed with railguns and nuclear missiles that Earth's military had adapted for space combat. The weapons had been tested against asteroids and derelict satellites, but never against alien warships with technology centuries ahead of human engineering. The sensor array showed 20 massive capital ships moving into Mars orbit, accompanied by what appeared to be 100 smaller escort and fighter craft. Their weapons were powered up and ready to fire. Jake felt his stomach tighten with the familiar pre-combat tension that never really went away, no matter how many battles a soldier survived. He activated the secure channel to Earth Command and waited for the connection. Admiral Frank Weber appeared on the main screen. His face was weathered from decades of military service, and his eyes carried the weight of impossible decisions. The Admiral spoke in the clipped tones of a man who had no time for false hope or gentle words. Captain Morrison was authorized to engage if fired upon. The colonies on Mars and the outer moons were evacuating, but they needed time. Jake's mission was to buy that time at any cost. The transmission ended, and Jake turned to face his crew. 42 men and women looked back at him with expressions ranging from determination to barely concealed fear. They had trained for years in simulators and exercises preparing for the day when humanity encountered hostile aliens. Now that day had arrived, and Jake needed to make sure they remembered their training. He spoke to them about duty and sacrifice, but also about survival. Their job was not to win an impossible fight, but to show the enemy that humans would not roll over and surrender without making someone bleed for it. Every minute they stayed in the fight was another minute for civilians to reach safety. Every shot they landed was a message that Earth would defend itself. The other 5 ships in the defensive line acknowledged their readiness. The destroyer Liberty, commanded by Captain Helen Price, took position on the Ranger's port side. The frigate Constitution moved to starboard. Under the steady hand of Commander Gary Webb, 3 corvettes filled out the formation, creating a thin line of human defiance against overwhelming alien firepower. General Craven stood on the command deck of his flagship, watching the primitive human vessels arrange themselves in what appeared to be a defensive formation, 6 small ships against his entire armada. The tactical analysis suggested this was either incredible bravery or profound stupidity. His experience suggested it was probably both. The general had commanded successful campaigns against 3 different species, and each time the initial resistance had crumbled quickly once the enemy realized the futility of fighting. His tactical officer reported that the human ships were holding position and their weapons were armed. Craven felt a slight stirring of curiosity mixed with irritation. These beings apparently needed a demonstration of imperial power before they would accept the inevitable. He gave the order to advance and destroy the human vessels. The battle began with a violent exchange of fire that lit up the darkness between Mars and Jupiter. Human railguns hurled magnetically accelerated projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. The solid slugs punched through energy shields that were calibrated to stop plasma and laser fire. Several alien escort ships took critical damage in the opening seconds as metal penetrators tore through their hulls. The Ranger shook violently as an alien plasma cannon scored a direct hit on the forward section. Armor plating designed to withstand micrometeorite impacts at orbital speeds vaporized under temperatures that matched the surface of a star. Damage reports flooded in from multiple sections. Hull breach on Deck 3. Fire in the port engine room. Casualties in the forward gun battery. Jake kept his ship in the fight through a combination of skill and desperate maneuvering. Amy launched a spread of nuclear missiles at the nearest alien cruiser. The warheads streaked across the void, trailing plumes of rocket exhaust. Point defense systems on the alien ship intercepted most of them, but 3 got through. The explosions bloomed like new suns against the cruiser's shields, and when the light faded, the ship was listing badly with its engines failing. The human defensive line was taking a brutal beating, but they were making the aliens pay for every meter of space. The Liberty scored a kill on an alien destroyer with a perfectly aimed railgun shot that penetrated the reactor core. The resulting explosion sent debris spinning off into space-trailing atmosphere and bodies. The Constitution launched its entire missile complement in one devastating volley that overwhelmed the defenses of an alien support ship. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every alien ship damaged or destroyed, 2 more moved up to take its place. The corvette Dallas took a direct hit from multiple plasma cannons and simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there fighting, and the next it was expanding gas and wreckage. The corvette Phoenix lasted 30 seconds longer before its reactor went critical. Jake watched his tactical display as the icons representing human ships blinked from green to yellow to red, and finally went dark. The Liberty was still fighting, but half its weapons were offline, and it was venting atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches. The Constitution had lost all power and was drifting helplessly through the combat zone. The Ranger took another catastrophic hit that tore through the engine section. Alarms screamed warnings about imminent reactor failure. Jake made the hardest decision of his life and activated the evacuation protocol. His voice carried across the ship's intercom telling his crew to abandon ship. This was not an order but a chance at survival. They had done their duty and bought the time Earth needed. Amy looked at him from her station with tears streaming down her face. She had served with Jake for 5 years and knew him well enough to recognize what he was planning. She started to protest, but he shook his head. The captain goes down with the ship was not just a tradition but a practical necessity. Someone needed to stay behind and make sure the evacuation proceeded smoothly. The crew abandoned their stations and headed for the escape pods. Jake watched them go while keeping the Rangers' remaining weapons firing at any alien ship that came into range. He targeted another cruiser and dumped his last missiles into its shield generators. The warheads detonated in a chain reaction that overloaded the alien defenses. The final explosion that consumed the Ranger was visible from Mars. The ship's reactor lost containment and released energy equivalent to a small star. The blast wave caught 2 alien escort ships that had moved in too close and sent them tumbling away with critical damage. Jake Morrison never felt the end. One moment he was at his station fighting, and the next there was only light. The escape pods scattered across space carrying the survivors of the battle. Amy Clark floated in her pod watching through the small viewport as the alien fleet continued its advance toward Earth. The pods had limited propulsion and would take days to reach the nearest safe harbor. She could only hope that the sacrifice of the Ranger and its sister ships had bought enough time. General Craven surveyed the aftermath of the engagement. His fleet had lost 8 ships destroyed and 12 more damaged badly enough to require extensive repairs. Over 3,000 warriors had died fighting 6 primitive vessels that should have been swept aside like debris. The tactical analysis made no sense. Human weapons were crude but effective. Human tactics were aggressive to the point of suicidal. They fought like cornered animals with nothing to lose. The general thought about Commander Zethrax and his warnings. Perhaps the old veteran had not been exaggerating after all. If 6 ships could do this much damage, what would hundreds do? What would thousands do? Craven pushed the uncomfortable thoughts aside and gave the order to continue toward Earth. The invasion would proceed as planned. But now he understood that taking the system would cost far more than anyone had anticipated. General Lisa Grant stood in the command center buried 300 feet beneath the Colorado mountains. The facility had been constructed during the height of the Cold War, when humanity's greatest fear was nuclear annihilation at the hands of other humans. Now it served as the nerve center for defending Earth against an enemy from the stars. Around her, dozens of officers coordinated defensive positions across the planet while massive screens displayed the tactical situation in orbit and beyond. The alien fleet had pushed past Mars' orbit and now hung just beyond the moon like a sword suspended over humanity's neck. Sensor data showed the invaders were regrouping after their encounter with Captain Morrison's defensive line. The cost had been higher than expected, but the aliens still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. 20 capital ships remained operational along with nearly 80 escort vessels and countless fighter craft. Colonel Pete Larson approached with a datapad containing the latest intelligence summary. His jaw was tight with barely contained anger as he reported another surrender demand from the alien commander. The terms had not changed since first contact. Humanity was to submit immediately to Imperial authority and accept integration into their galactic empire. Resistance would result in the systematic destruction of Earth's major population. Centers Lisa had spent 30 years in uniform working her way up from a young lieutenant fresh out of the academy to her current position as Commander of Earth Defense. She had seen combat in 3 major conflicts and numerous smaller engagements. She had lost friends and comrades to enemy fire. She had made impossible decisions that saved thousands but cost hundreds. None of that prepared her for the weight of knowing that her next decision would determine the fate of billions. She looked at the faces of her staff and saw determination mixed with fear. They were waiting for her to give them hope or at least direction. Lisa took a breath and spoke in a voice that carried through the entire command center. Earth did not surrender. Not today and not ever. She ordered the communications officer to send that exact message to the alien fleet. The response came within minutes. Kinetic strike packages and plasma beams began falling from orbit toward military installations and major cities. The aliens had clearly studied Earth's defensive capabilities and were targeting power grids, communications hubs, and command centers. They wanted to decapitate human leadership and break the will to resist in one overwhelming strike. But Earth had been preparing for this moment since the first radio telescopes detected signs of intelligent life beyond the solar system. Underground bunkers sealed as millions of civilians sought shelter in facilities designed to survive everything from nuclear war to asteroid impacts. Defensive shields powered by fusion reactors flickered to life over major population centers. The energy barriers were adapted from experimental technology that was supposed to protect spacecraft from radiation but had been repurposed to stop orbital bombardment. Point defense systems across the planet opened fire at once. Thousands of missiles and railgun rounds created a wall of steel and fire between the alien fleet and their targets. Laser arrays on mountaintops and hidden installations tracked incoming projectiles and burned them out of the sky. Not every shot could be stopped, but enough were intercepted that civilian casualties remained lower than the worst projections. Lisa gave the order to return fire. From hidden silos scattered across every continent, missiles roared toward orbit. From the lunar bases that officially did not exist, mass drivers hurled projectiles at velocities that made them nearly impossible to intercept. From armed stations disguised as commercial satellites, weapon systems came online and began engaging the nearest alien ships. Earth struck back with everything it had. General Craven watched in growing disbelief as his tactical display filled with red warning indicators. The human counterattack was far more coordinated and powerful than any intelligence report had suggested. These primitives had hidden their true military capabilities behind a facade of peaceful scientific exploration. They had orbital weapons platforms disguised as research stations. They had lunar bases that sensors had missed completely. They had turned their entire planet into a fortress. The general ordered his fleet to pull back to high orbit and regroup. Staying within the engagement envelope of Earth's defensive network was suicide. Already 3 more ships had taken critical damage and 1 carrier was burning through its hull after a direct hit from a human mass driver. The retreat was tactical and temporary, but it was still a retreat. The Empire's forces were being pushed back by a species that should not have been able to fight at all. Lisa allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as the alien fleet withdrew. The first wave had been stopped, but she knew this was far from over. The enemy would adapt and return with new tactics. She ordered damage assessment teams to begin surveys of the affected areas, while repair crews worked on the damaged defensive systems. Casualty reports were coming in, but preliminary numbers suggested thousands rather than millions. The shelters and shields had done their job. Lieutenant Chris Walker sat in the cockpit of his fighter craft on the runway of a concealed airbase in the Nevada desert. Around him, 11 other pilots prepared for launch. They were part of Delta Squadron, one of dozens of fighter groups positioned around the planet for exactly this scenario. Chris had been flying combat missions since he was 22 years old. He had logged over 1,000 hours in atmospheric fighters before transitioning to the space-capable interceptors that Earth had developed in secret. The launch order came. Through his helmet comm, and Chris pushed the throttle forward. The fighter screamed down the runway and lifted into the sky, trailing plasma from its hybrid engines. Within seconds, the squadron was climbing through the atmosphere toward the orbital combat zone. His wingman, Captain Sophie Bennett, flew beside him with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this her entire adult life. They reached the debris field that marked the boundary between Earth's controlled space and the alien-occupied zone. Wreckage from both sides floated in slowly decaying orbits. Chris could see what remained of the Ranger drifting among the debris like a metal grave marker. He keyed his comm and spoke to his squadron. They were going after an alien carrier that had moved in closer than the others. Fast approach and weapons free on his mark, Sophie acknowledged with her usual mix of professionalism and dark humor. She told Chris not to do anything stupid and to try keeping up with her. Despite the fear that lived in every pilot's chest before combat, she managed to sound almost casual. It was a defense mechanism that Chris understood well. If you acknowledged how terrifying this was, then the fear might paralyze you. The squadron dove through a storm of defensive fire from the alien carrier's escort ships. Energy beams cut through space in patterns designed to create kill zones that nothing could fly through alive. Chris lost 2 pilots in the first 30 seconds. Their fighters simply vanished in flashes of light that burned afterimages into his vision. The rest of the squadron scattered and reformed, weaving between the deadly beams with reflexes honed by years of training. Chris armed his missiles and locked onto the carrier's massive engine section. The targeting computer struggled with the alien ship's electronic countermeasures but finally achieved lock. He fired everything he had and pulled into a hard turn that pushed him deep into his seat. Sophie and 4 other pilots followed his lead, sending their own missiles streaking toward the same target. The carrier's point defenses shot down most of the incoming warheads, but enough got through. Nuclear explosions bloomed against the ship's shields and hull. The carrier shuddered and began listing to one side as its primary engines failed. Secondary explosions rippled along its length as internal systems overloaded. The massive vessel began a slow, inevitable fall toward Earth's atmosphere, where friction and heat would finish what the squadron had started. Sophie whooped over the comm channel and called out their next target. Chris checked his ammunition status and saw he had maybe one more good pass before he would be running on fumes. His fuel reserves were already in the yellow and the trip back to base would be tight. But there were still alien ships in orbit and people on the ground depending on them to keep fighting. General Lisa Grant watched the tactical display as human forces engaged the alien fleet across multiple fronts. Fighter squadrons were harassing the enemy capital ships while missile batteries on the surface continued their bombardment. The aliens were responding with increasing ferocity, but they were no longer advancing. The battle had turned into a brutal stalemate that was bleeding both sides dry. Colonel Pete Larson reported that several alien ships appeared to be withdrawing from the combat zone entirely. Their damage was too severe to continue fighting. Lisa marked them as lower priority targets and focused on the ships that still posed an immediate threat. Resources were limited and every missile fired had to count. She thought about Captain Morrison and the crew of the Ranger. Their sacrifice had bought time for Earth to prepare its defenses. Now it was up to everyone else to make sure that sacrifice meant something. Lisa had no illusions about the difficulty of what lay ahead. The aliens still had superior technology and numbers, but humans had something that could not be measured in weapons or ships. They had a willingness to fight for their home that transcended logic or survival instinct. Commander Zethrak stood on the bridge of his fast courier ship as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system. The vessel was small and lightly armed, designed for speed and discretion rather than combat. He had requisitioned it from the reserve fleet without proper authorization and left the Imperial station 3 days after the invasion force departed. The Council had not sent him and would likely court-martial him for this unauthorized journey, but Zethrax no longer cared about politics or regulations. What he saw through the viewport made his blood run cold. The tactical sensors painted a picture of devastation that confirmed his worst fears. The proud Imperial fleet that had departed with such confidence was now scattered and damaged. 8 capital ships were simply gone, reduced to debris fields that would orbit this system for centuries. 12 more showed critical damage with hulls breached and systems failing. The human defensive forces appeared battered, but remained operational and aggressive. Zetharax activated his command codes and broadcast them on all Imperial military frequencies. The codes identified him as a decorated war hero with clearance that superseded standard chain of command protocols. It was an authority that existed more in tradition than official regulation, but it got him through the fleet's defensive perimeter. Within an hour, he received permission to dock with General Craven's flagship. The corridors of the massive warship told the story of brutal combat. Repair crews worked frantically to patch hull breaches while medical teams rushed wounded soldiers to overwhelmed infirmaries. Scorch marks from internal fires marred the walls and the acrid smell of burned electronics filled the air. Zethrax had seen this before on other campaigns that had gone terribly wrong. He found General Craven on the command deck staring at tactical displays that showed the current stalemate. The general looked exhausted and his scales had lost some of their natural luster. Combat stress and lack of sleep were taking their toll on someone who had expected a quick and easy victory. Craven turned as Zethrax approached and his expression shifted from surprise to barely concealed hostility. The general spoke in clipped tones that barely masked his anger. Commander Zethrax had no authority in this system and no business interfering with an active military operation. He was here without orders and his presence was unwelcome. Craven had enough problems without dealing with a rogue officer who thought his past service gave him the right to question current command, decisions Zethrax ignored. the hostility and moved to the tactical display. He studied the data with an expert eye that had analyzed countless battlefields. The situation was worse than he had imagined. Human forces had fought the Imperial fleet to a standstill using inferior technology and sheer determination. Every engagement showed the same pattern. The aliens would attack expecting easy victory, and the humans would make them pay in blood for every meter of space. He turned to face the general and spoke with the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. Craven was repeating every mistake that Zethrax had seen in 40 years of warfare. The general was fighting humans as if they were a typical species that would surrender when losses became unacceptable. But humans did not calculate acceptable losses the way other species did. They did not retreat when logic demanded it. They were Death World predators, and the general had invaded their territory. Craven's anger flared, and he demanded to know what gave Zethrax the right to criticize. The general had 3 times the human numbers and superior technology. He would prevail through persistence and overwhelming force. This was merely taking longer than anticipated, but the outcome was inevitable. The Empire had never lost a conquest campaign and would not start now. Zethrax pulled up the casualty reports and forced Craven to look at them. The general had lost 30 ships in 2 weeks of fighting. That was more warriors killed than the entire 5-year campaign against the Kryn Rebellion. The humans were not weakening, but adapting. Every engagement taught them something new about Imperial tactics and technology. They were learning faster than the Empire could adjust. The old commander activated footage from recent battles. He showed Craven a human pilot designated as Eagle 7, who had survived 16 separate encounters with Imperial fighters. Each time the pilot emerged from combat, he flew better and fought smarter. Then he trained other pilots in what he had learned. This was not just individual skill, but a systematic approach to warfare that treated every battle as a learning opportunity. Zethrax changed the display to show historical data he had compiled on human civilization. Their entire existence had been an endless cycle of conflict and adaptation. They fought wars that killed millions and then studied those wars to fight more efficiently the next time. They had destroyed entire cities with atomic fire and rebuilt them stronger than before. They created weapons capable of rendering their planet uninhabitable, and they still chose to exist. General Craven watched the data scroll past, and something shifted in his expression. The anger faded and was replaced by a weariness that came from finally accepting an uncomfortable truth. He had walked into this campaign assuming victory was guaranteed. Now he was trapped in a meat grinder that was consuming his fleet ship by ship and warrior by warrior. The general asked what Zethrax proposed. Retreat was impossible without explicit council authorization, and continuing the current strategy would result in eventual defeat. The fleet was stuck between 2 equally unacceptable options. Craven had sent reports back to the Imperial station, but responses were delayed by the distance, and the council showed no inclination to change their orders. Zethrax spoke the word that every military officer dreaded: negotiate. The humans had proven they could defend their system. Continuing to fight would only result in more deaths on both sides with no clear path to victory. The Empire needed to accept that humans were not going to surrender and find a different approach. Offer them trade agreements and technology exchange. Give them alliance instead of conquest. Treat them as equals rather than subjects. The suggestion was radical and went against every Imperial protocol. The Empire did not negotiate with species they intended to absorb. But Craven was experienced enough to recognize when doctrine needed to adapt to reality. He asked what would happen if the Council refused to authorize negotiations. What if they sent reinforcements and ordered the campaign to continue? Zethrax answered with brutal honesty. This fleet would die here, and the next fleet would die as well. Eventually, the humans would build ships capable of reaching Imperial space. And when they did, they would remember who attacked them first. The Empire would transform a potential ally into an eternal enemy. Humans had a documented history of holding grudges for generations. They would not forget, and they would not forgive. The old commander pulled up more footage showing human endurance and determination. He showed scientists working for decades on single problems. He showed athletes training their entire lives for brief moments of competition. He showed rescue workers digging through rubble with bare hands to save strangers. Humans did not quit when success seemed impossible. They kept going because something in their nature refused to accept defeat. General Craven stood in silence for several minutes, studying the tactical displays and historical data. Around him, the command deck bustled with activity as officers tried to maintain defensive positions against constant human probing attacks. The general could feel his fleet slowly bleeding out. Every hour brought new damage reports and casualty lists. The humans were not launching massive assaults but instead wore down Imperial forces through persistent harassment. Finally, Craven made his decision. He would request authorization for ceasefire negotiations from the Council. If they refused, he would proceed anyway and face court-martial, rather than lead his remaining warriors to pointless deaths. The general had enough blood on his hands and was not willing to add more just to satisfy political pride. Zethrax felt relief wash over him. This was not a perfect solution, but it was better than the alternative. He offered to serve as an advisor during the negotiations. His experience with other species and his understanding of human psychology might prove valuable. Craven accepted the offer with something approaching gratitude. The message went out on all channels directed at Earth Command. The Imperial fleet was requesting formal ceasefire negotiations. They proposed a neutral location between Earth and the Moon, where both sides could meet and discuss terms. The fighting would continue until an agreement was reached, but both sides would limit engagement to defensive actions only. The response from General Lisa Grant came within an hour. Earth accepted the ceasefire proposal with the condition that the alien fleet withdrew to beyond lunar orbit. Negotiations would take place at a designated Lagrange point, where neither side held tactical advantage. Human representatives would arrive within 48 hours. Zethrax watched as the Imperial fleet began its withdrawal. Ships that had been locked in combat for 2 weeks slowly pulled back from Earth's defensive envelope. Human forces tracked their movement but held fire. The shooting had not stopped completely, but the intensity dropped dramatically. Both sides used the lull to repair damage and tend to wounded. The old commander looked at the blue planet hanging in space and wondered what kind of beings would fight so desperately for their home. He had fought warriors from 100 different worlds, but something about humans was different. They possessed a combination of intelligence, adaptability, and sheer stubborn willpower that made them uniquely dangerous. The Empire had made a terrible mistake in attacking them, but perhaps that mistake could still be turned into something positive. General Craven stood beside Zethrax, staring at the same view. The general spoke quietly about the warriors he had lost and the families that would receive notification of their deaths. He had won battles before, but never at such cost against such an unexpected enemy. Craven admitted that Zethrax had been right to warn the Council. The old veteran had tried to prevent this disaster, and no one had listened. Zethrax replied that the Council would listen now. The Empire had been humbled by a species they dismissed as primitive. That lesson would resonate through the halls of power in ways that his warnings never could. Sometimes people needed to touch fire before they believed it burned. The Empire had touched fire and learned respect. The negotiation station hung in space at the Lagrange point between Earth and the Moon, like a temporary bridge between two civilizations. Human engineers and alien technicians had worked together for 3 days to construct the neutral facility from prefabricated modules. The station consisted of a central meeting chamber surrounded by separate docking bays and quarters for both delegations. Security protocols ensured that neither side could gain tactical advantage while maintaining enough separation to prevent accidental incidents. General Lisa Grant arrived aboard a human shuttle accompanied by 6 advisors chosen for their expertise in military strategy, diplomacy, and xenobiology. She wore her full dress uniform with ribbons that represented 30 years of service in 3 major conflicts. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her expression carried the weight of someone who had seen too much death and wanted desperately to prevent more. The human delegation entered the station through an airlock that pressurized with a hiss of equalizing atmosphere. Inside the main chamber, they found the alien representatives already waiting. General Craven stood at the head of his group, looking far less confident than he probably had before the battle began. His scales showed signs of stress, and his movements carried the stiffness of someone nursing injuries that had not fully healed. Commander Zethrax stood beside Craven along with High Counselor Vrenthal, who had traveled from the Imperial Station specifically for these negotiations. The counselor's crystalline form refracted the station's lights in patterns that seemed almost nervous. Also present was Counselor Drexel, contained in the diplomatic shell that allowed the energy being to interact with physical environments. Lisa approached the conference table that dominated the center of the room. The table had been designed to accommodate both human and alien physiologies, with adjustable seating and environmental controls. She took her position across from the alien delegation and met their eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had earned the right to be here through blood and sacrifice. "High Counselor." Frenthal spoke first, and the translation devices rendered his crystalline voice tones into comprehensible English. The Empire acknowledged that initial intelligence regarding human military capabilities had been significantly flawed. They were prepared to offer reparations for the unprovoked attack and to establish formal diplomatic relations. The counselor's tone carried something that might have been humility, mixed with grudging respect. Lisa listened carefully while her advisors took notes on datapads. She waited until Vrenthal finished before responding with words she had carefully prepared during the flight. Earth accepted the ceasefire and was willing to discuss terms for lasting peace. However, humanity needed more than just apologies and financial compensation. They needed assurances that this would never happen again, and a framework for future interaction between their species and the broader galactic community. Colonel Pete Larson presented a detailed accounting of human casualties and damages. 3,000 military personnel killed in action, 1,200 civilians dead from orbital bombardment despite the defensive shields, extensive damage to orbital infrastructure and ground installations. The numbers represented lives lost and families destroyed. Money could not bring those people back, but it could help rebuild and provide for those they left. Behind, Commander Zethrex requested permission to speak, and both delegations turned their attention to the scarred veteran. He proposed something that went beyond simple reparations and diplomatic recognition. The Empire had much to offer in terms of technology and knowledge that could advance human civilization by centuries. Medical treatments that could eliminate diseases, power generation systems that were clean and nearly limitless, manufacturing techniques that could end scarcity and hunger. In exchange, Zethrak suggested that humans offer something the Empire desperately needed. The Imperial military had grown complacent over centuries of easy victories against species that surrendered quickly. They had forgotten the fundamental principles of warfare that went beyond superior technology and overwhelming numbers. Human military academies and training programs could teach those lessons to a new generation of Imperial officers. General Craven supported the proposal with the conviction of someone who had learned hard truths through bitter experience. His fleet had possessed every advantage except the understanding that wars were won by warriors, not weapons. Human tactical doctrine emphasized adaptability, persistence, and creative problem-solving. Those qualities had nearly destroyed his invasion force and could revitalize the Imperial military if properly integrated into their training. Lisa exchanged glances with her advisors and saw cautious interest on their faces. The proposal had merit but also carried risks. Teaching potential enemies how humans thought and fought could backfire spectacularly if relations deteriorated in the future. However, refusing the offer meant missing an opportunity to influence galactic civilization from within while gaining access to technology that could transform life on Earth. She asked about Earth's sovereignty and political independence. Any agreement needed to guarantee that humans would govern themselves without imperial interference. There could be no colonial administration or enforced integration into the Empire's political structure. Earth would remain free to chart its own course while participating in the broader galactic community as an equal. Partner Counselor Vrenthal conferred briefly with the other alien representatives before responding. Earth would be recognized as an independent sovereign power with full rights and protections under galactic law. The Empire would not interfere with human internal affairs or attempt to impose imperial authority. Furthermore, they would support Earth's eventual application for representation on the Galactic Council when humanity was ready to pursue that option. The negotiations continued for 3 days as lawyers and diplomats from both sides worked through the complex details. Trade agreements were established with fair terms that protected both parties' interests. Cultural exchange programs were initiated to promote understanding between species. Technology sharing protocols were developed with safeguards to prevent misuse. Military training partnerships were outlined with clear boundaries and oversight mechanisms. On the final day, both delegations gathered to sign the formal treaty. The document existed in multiple formats to accommodate different physiologies and recording methods. Human representatives signed with traditional ink on paper, while alien representatives imprinted their agreement through various biological and technological means. The moment felt historic and fragile, like watching the first steps of something that could grow into lasting friendship or collapse into renewed conflict. Commander Zethrax requested a private meeting with several human officers, including Lieutenant Amy Clark, who had survived the destruction of the Ranger. Amy approached the scarred veteran with understandable caution mixed with curiosity. She had heard about his warnings to the Galactic Council and his unauthorized journey to stop the invasion. Zethrax spoke with genuine respect about the warriors who had fought against impossible odds. He had reviewed tactical recordings from every engagement and seen courage and skill that rivaled anything in his 40 years of military service. The humans had fought well and made the Empire pay dearly for its arrogance. They had earned recognition as formidable warriors and potential valuable allies. Amy asked why he had tried to warn the Council about humanity. She wanted to understand what motivated an alien soldier to risk his career defending a species he had never met. Zethrax explained that he was old enough to recognize a warrior race when he encountered one. More importantly, he was wise enough to know that such races made better friends than enemies. Lieutenant Chris Walker joined the conversation along with Captain Sophie Bennett. Both pilots had survived the orbital battles and accumulated combat records that impressed even the alien veteran. Zethrax asked about their training methods and tactical philosophies. He wanted to understand how humans developed such aggressive and adaptive fighting styles. Chris explained that human military doctrine emphasized initiative and flexibility. Soldiers were taught to think for themselves and adapt to changing circumstances rather than blindly following rigid plans. Every pilot trained extensively in basic maneuvers, but was expected to innovate and improvise during actual combat. The best warriors were those who could assess situations instantly and make correct decisions under extreme stress. Sophie added that humans studied their own history obsessively. Every war was analyzed for lessons that could be applied to future conflicts. Military academies taught about ancient battles alongside modern warfare because the fundamental principles remained constant. Understanding why humans fought and how they adapted to adversity was more important than memorizing technical specifications of weapon systems. 6 months passed and the relationship between Earth and the Empire evolved in unexpected ways. Human ships began operating alongside Imperial vessels on joint patrols in unstable regions of the galactic rim. The first human officers arrived at the Imperial War College on the capital world, bringing with them teaching methods that shocked traditional instructors. Alien scientists worked in laboratories on Earth, collaborating with human researchers on projects that blended different technological approaches. General Lisa Grant stood on the observation deck of the orbital station Unity that had been constructed to replace the damaged infrastructure around Earth. She watched ships from a dozen different worlds moving through the space lanes that had been empty of alien visitors just months before. The scars of battle were still visible on the lunar surface, and several damaged sections of the defensive network remained under repair. Colonel Pete Larson joined her at the viewport. He commented on how strange it felt to see alien ships near Earth without feeling the need to target them for destruction. 6 months ago, they had been enemies locked in brutal combat. Now they were trading partners and tentative allies working toward mutual benefit. Lisa agreed but maintained her natural caution. Trust needed to be built slowly through consistent actions over time. The treaty was a good start, but paper agreements meant nothing without follow-through. Both humans and aliens would need to prove their commitment to cooperation through deeds, not just words. The fact that trade was flowing and joint military operations were proceeding smoothly suggested positive momentum. She thought about Captain Jake Morrison and the crew of the Ranger. Their sacrifice had bought time for Earth to mount an effective defense. The memorial station bearing Morrison's name orbited Mars as a permanent reminder of those who gave everything to protect their home. Amy Clark had attended the dedication ceremony along with survivors from all 6 ships that fought in that first desperate battle. Below them, Earth continued its eternal rotation, displaying continents and oceans to the darkness of space. The planet looked peaceful from this distance, but Lisa knew that humanity had changed fundamentally through contact with alien civilization. They were no longer alone in the universe, and that realization carried both promise and peril. The future would bring new challenges and opportunities that previous generations could never have imagined. Commander Zethrax visited Earth once during those 6 months and spent time walking through cities that had been targeted during the orbital bombardment. He saw the reconstruction efforts and spoke with civilians who had survived in the shelters. The old veteran was impressed by human resilience and their determination to rebuild stronger than before. He told Lisa that humans reminded him of a species called the Vorton, who inhabited a death world in the galactic core. Both races possessed an unbreakable spirit that made them dangerous enemies but loyal friends. The galaxy was learning about humanity through direct contact and second-hand reports. Some species viewed humans with suspicion as potential threats to stability. Others saw opportunity for alliance with a warrior race that had humbled the Empire. Everyone agreed that Earth's arrival on the galactic stage represented a significant shift in the balance of power and influence. High Counselor Vrenthal admitted privately that the Council had made a catastrophic error in underestimating humanity. The invasion had cost the Empire ships, warriors, and prestige while gaining nothing except a painful lesson about assumptions and arrogance. However, the Counselor also acknowledged that the resulting alliance might ultimately prove more valuable than conquest would have been. Humans brought fresh perspectives and approaches that challenged imperial stagnation. General Lisa Grant understood that the treaty represented not an ending, but a beginning. Humanity had announced its presence to the galaxy in blood and fire. Now they needed to prove they deserved a place among the stars through their actions and achievements. The road ahead would be difficult and filled with challenges, but humans had never backed down from difficulty. They had faced the Empire and survived. Whatever came next, they would handle together as a united species with allies who had learned to respect them.